and reporting from them in the Earth Negotiation Bulletin. And so I don't know if you know this publication, but this is something that appears in many MEA negotiations and tries to give you an objective overview of what's going on. So this is basically that I've been doing that since 2000, well, I did that since 2004. Now that I'm a professor, I'm doing it a little bit less, but that's also something that's forced me to really try to understand the rules of procedure and all the details, because in the EMB you have to have an overarching picture of what's going on and you have to be able to report it right. So climate change has been the process that I've been following mostly, and climate change is also the area on which I focus more in my academic life, and I've also worked for the Finnish government doing climate change issues. I've worked quite a lot as a consultant for various international organizations doing work on climate change. So I think that's my main substantive area. I guess now I'll hand it over to other members of the team organizing, basically the resource persons who are responsible for running this course this year, and I'll give the floor to each and every one of them to say a few words about them as an introduction.
Thanks, Kati, and I'll keep it brief. So hi again, Hardo van Asselt with the University of Eastern Finland. My background is a bit like Kati's. I've been working on climate change for the last 17 years now, focusing a lot on the international climate negotiations, but also European climate policy and climate policy at the national level. My background is partly in academia, so I've been working at the University of Eastern Finland, and then before that also at the Free University in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. But I've also been working at a think tank called the Stockholm Environment Institute, where I've been trying to go beyond, let's say, research and trying to see how research can be made useful to policymakers and to decision making, both at the international and at the national level. And that's why I'm also very interested always in this course, because I think it provides an excellent opportunity for people with a more academic inclination to sit together with policymakers to discuss some of the real world problems that they are dealing with. I'll leave it at that.
Hi everyone, I'm Seita Romppanen. I work as a senior lecturer on international environmental law at the CCL. I teach courses, then I do research mostly on EU climate and energy law, and then I do projects such as this course. And I have a long history with this course. I've been involved since 2005, so this is my 15th course. I started as a course assistant, then moved to work as Bradley for several years, and then now share the responsibility of coordinating the course together with Kati and Harro. So I'm very happy to see yet once again a really interesting group of people enthusiastic about the course. And then I'm also the editor of the course review together with my colleague Tuula Honkonen, and tomorrow I'll be presenting more with few words on your opportunities with the publication. So welcome also from my behalf to the 16th course.
Hello everybody, welcome. My name is Maria Eugenia Recio. I'm also working at the University of Eastern Finland. I'm a researcher. I work on topics that relate to climate change and forest issues. And I've been for more than 10 years also involved with international negotiations, also as Kati, working at the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, reporting mainly on different, processes such as climate process, forest process, and biodiversity protection. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I hope that we will have very fruitful conversations during these days. Thank you.
Yes, hello again. I think you've already got quite tired of my voice, but Kati told me that I have to come and present myself, so I will do it once again. So my name is Tita Korvenoja, and I'm working right now at UNEP headquarters in the law division. I'm heading a branch of approximately 22 people. The branch is called Environmental Governance and Conventions. The focus of our work is really international environmental governance issues and the contacts and the dialogue with the MEAs, especially those which UNEP hosts secretariat functions to. Just to say that this sounds like that we are very much involved in more kind of a policy work, but to be frank with you, we have lots of projects going on right now. I think we have like, I tried to calculate, but I think it's approximately maybe 7 million euros a year, or dollars a year, that we are now tied to by projects. So the projects are very interesting. Some of them are directly supporting countries in implementing their commitments under several MEAs, and also trying to support countries building up integrated approaches to engage more in a balanced way nationally in 2030 agenda exercises. So about my background, I've been working at the Ministry of the Environment for ages before moving to UNEP. I've been in UNEP right now for 5 months, I think. In Finland, I have held various positions. Also, I at some stage was UNEP focal point for Finland, so I know UNEP quite well. When I left, I was heading the International Affairs unit, which was dealing not only with UN affairs, but also Arctic cooperation, Nordic cooperation, and EU cooperation. To end, well, I'm not an academic. I have studied international relations and development studies, but just to say that I've been, well, first of all, I've known Kati for a very long time, but I can't remember actually when we met, maybe during the climate negotiations, that's the linkage. And I've been involved in Finland now. I think we have this publication which has now 4th edition going on. I've been coordinating, actually, I'm an editor of it. Unfortunately, it's in Finnish language, but just to say it's a good publication, and maybe if you want to have or reflect on it, just to think that if you wanted to do something similar in your home country, it's the best practice. It's a book, source book, which goes through the major global MEAs, explaining the commitments and how the architecture of the conventions, but it's also looking into the financial aspects, and especially how the Finnish development cooperation funding has been changing during the years to support these conventions. Also looking at the IEG structures. So that's maybe my kind of more academic background to this exercise here.
Hi, my name is Bradley Luisa Anna Martzagala. If you can't pronounce Bradley, Luisa, Anna, Luisana, I answer to everything. I do know it's a difficult name to pronounce. So I've been the one bombarding you with emails the last several months, and it's wonderful to meet you in person. I am a research assistant and graduate student at UEF and work as a climate reality leader for the NGO, the Climate Reality Project. This is my 4th course. The last 3 years I've worked as the course assistant, and this is my first year coordinating logistics. So you're all here, you made it. I've done part 1 come to completion, and I look forward to seeing you in the next couple of weeks. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at any time. I'll try and answer as fast as I can. I wear a lot of red, so if you see someone moving in red, you feel free to try and grab me, and let's see if we can sort things out.
Excellent, many thanks. You can now choose if you want to stay with me on the podium or you want to escape. Okay, so then just quick few words about our university and our center. We brought you some pictures with snow, for example. Of course, we sometimes have the course in Finland in Joensuu. Now it's 2 degrees and raining, so I don't know. I'm actually quite happy being here, but it's of course a very lovely location in eastern Finland and very beautiful landscapes. Yeah, I think that we are practicing. I'm definitely practicing flexibility because, as I said, this is what you need in the negotiations. Elisa was here. Now my laptop actually died during the lunch break, so the presentation I had prepared is there, and this is something I borrowed from Seita. So just to quickly say, I guess I wanted to introduce a little bit our center. CEEL, the Center for Climate Change, Energy and Environmental Law, and say a few words about our other activities apart from this course. CEEL was created in 2013, so our university has put a lot of priority, like given environmental issues, sustainable development issues, a high priority. That also applies to the law school, so climate law and environmental law feature very high on the law school's agenda and its priority areas, and we are definitely the biggest concentration of expertise in these areas in Finland, and I think perhaps, I mean, the center has grown a lot, so we have 7 professors in the areas of covered by the center, and next January will be 9 professors. We have approximately 10 people working for us with PhDs, so as postdocs or senior researchers or senior lecturers, and then we have more than 35 PhD students. So in 6 years, the center has grown quite a lot. We have different research groups, so Harro and I, we are leading the group that's working on international environmental law and climate law issues, climate change issues. So climate change is definitely one area that features very strongly in the research and in other activities that we do. And we also have a very big group looking at Finnish environmental law, and then we have a very well-known group looking at energy law issues. And this course is one of the activities that we do, and Tita mentioned that she's not an academic. Well, I think one of the brilliant things about this course is that the aim is to bring practitioners and academics together. And I think this is a very valuable form of interaction also from us. I mean, I think Harro and many others in the center, we've sort of been switching hats and roles during our career, so we have sort of experience from both sides, but I think that I very much value the opportunity of having participants with different backgrounds and being also able to interact with sort of between the practical and academic communities. So I guess in the interest of time, this is probably what I will say about the center. Perhaps one other thing to mention, that we of course also provide education, which is one of the key functions at the university, and we have 2 international master's degree programs which are taught in English. One that we've been running since 2012, which is focusing on environmental and climate change law and policy. So it's an interdisciplinary program that we're running with the Environmental Policy Department or International Environmental Policy people at our university. And then we have a very interesting new program that we just launched this autumn, and that's a joint Nordic master's degree program. So this means that we have 3 different universities from 3 different Nordic countries, so Finland, Norway and Sweden. We have funding from the Nordic Council of Ministers, and the idea is that during this program, students spend time approximately half a year at each of the 3 universities, and then they get a joint degree. Well, they get the degrees, Masters of Law degrees from all the 3 universities. Yeah. So I think that's also something that's not been done. I mean, this is the first program in Finland with in law. So also I think a very interesting opportunity for students, and something that I want to advertise if you have some candidates in mind who want to do some postgraduate education. But I guess now we have, we have 5 minutes before we go to the picture. We have 10 minutes, okay, so, okay, then it makes definitely sense to start. So let's do a quick round of introduction. We won't have a lot of time, so I want you to be brief, but what I think would be very interesting for us is that when you say your name and what you do, like what your focus area is in your work, but also what are your expectations from this course? What do you want to learn? What was your motivation to come here? So then we can, I think it's interesting for us to see what your expectations are, and we can do our best to try to meet them. So with that, perhaps we can start, let's start from there. And Okay, excellent, thank you. So we'll stop the introductory round there for a while, and then we'll go and have our picture taken, and then please come back and sit approximately in the same places so that we can continue the round when we come back. Okay, so we can continue the introductory round. So originally in the schedule, we had a coffee break now, but we'll finish the introductions, and then we have coffee, and then we have Elisa's lecture. So I guess where we ended is that now would be somewhere behind, yes, there, if you well, I mean, I let you agree who wants to start. Excellent. And just a quick note that please try to be quite brief so that we can finish the introduction around sort of a little at around 3 o'clock. So if you take like 1 minute approximately each, then that would allow this to happen. So please continue. Okay, excellent. I think that concludes our round of introductions. Is there anyone who feels that they haven't? No, I think that we've covered everyone. So we have now the coffee break that was scheduled, and I suggest that we shorten it a little bit and we come back at 3:20 for Elisa Morchera's keynote. So we have the coffee, I think, outside where you are already in the familiar place, and then please be back here at 20:20. I don't see Bradley here, so I'm not sure if she will be here to lock the door or... if you want to leave your things here, we can arrange for someone to be here until we find Bradley and we'll lock it. So, I mean, you can just relax and go for coffee, and you can leave the things here. Okay, I think we are all here, and I think most importantly, we have now Elisa here, so we can go to the part of the program that was transferred from the morning to the afternoon, and that is the second keynote. So it's with great pleasure that we can now welcome here Elisa Morchera, who's Professor of Global Environmental Law at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. And she will give us now her keynote, and she will also be staying with us during the course until the very end, so you'll have plenty of opportunities to get to know Elisa better and interact with her. So please, Elisa.
Okay. Does it work? Yes. All right. Well, good afternoon, and I'm really sorry I arrived late, but I hope the two keynote presentations will still be linked enough, and the first one from this morning fresh in your mind. And it's always lovely to participate and contribute to this course. I'm sure you know a lot more on many issues, or you have a lot of experiences that will speak to some of the issues I'll discuss in this lecture. So I look forward to exchanging ideas with you and seeing what your own experience can contribute to this reflection. And I'm very grateful to the organizers for the challenging and exciting topic they chose for the keynote reflections, really looking at the structure of international environmental governance and whether it is equipped to deal with emerging environmental issues. I've been asked to give a scholarly perspective, and that's also quite interesting for me because my career actually started with the United Nations. I worked with the UN Development Program initially in the Eastern Caribbean, and later on with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. I wasn't actually planning an academic career, but things turned out that way, and since joining academia 10 years ago, I've still been very much involved in UN processes, both at the MEA level, working with the secretariats, but also sometimes advising governments or civil society about certain negotiations. And also doing some work more about implementation at the national level. Also in my own research, I've done quite a lot of field work and really trying to understand issues from the local level and what difference, if any, international environmental law makes on the ground and in the context of particularly localized tensions related to conservation and sustainable use. So I think for the past 10 years, I've been wondering, in light of my own experience, what is the value added of academic research and a scholarly perspective to the amazing work that's already happening in UN negotiations and processes that are supported by the UN. And of course, there's lots of understanding and knowledge in those fora, but there are, of course, important limitations that not only have to do with the politics, but also with the mandates of different institutions and some other dynamics that emerge in certain contexts and negotiations and tend to limit the opportunities to understand how you can address a new issue or a new challenge. So I think what has been my take and what I'm trying to explore with you in this talk is really looking at bringing together the two worlds a bit more, how a UN perspective and an academic perspective can be much more integrated than they are today, and how that can be helpful in addressing new and emerging challenges. And I think a key issue, something that has helped me in my own career, has really been that deep, detailed understanding of where the political pushback comes from. Why governments are not keen to address certain issues internationally, or why they're not interested in discussing a particular solution, having that really granular understanding of where the pushback is coming from, what are the reasons. It's really something that leads to very important legal research questions. And that's where, being an academic, you have maybe more time and leeway and flexibility to explore possible answers to that. And at the same time, also some looking out of the box and thinking, well, there's not only a possible answer or solution, additional options that we can bring to the table, but also an understanding of what are the missed opportunities once we are caught in a situation where the politics restrict our ambition or our choice of potential solutions. So I know you've discussed in the morning a few examples of emerging issues for international environmental governance, and you'll hear, I think, about many specific examples in the lectures you'll have later on this week. For my own purposes, I guess what I want to mention is that while there are new issues that emerge from scientific advancements and technological developments, including new threats to the environment, they may emerge from technological advances or even scientific advances. What's been quite interesting is that we also have more and more a sense that well-known environmental challenges, we are not really responding as well as we could, even in areas where we thought the international environmental cooperation had achieved important results. We're seeing those results either eroded or undermined. And so in a way, it's helpful to think about emerging environmental issues, but these are not necessarily new issues. It might just be new threats or new processes that undermine progress on well-known issues in global environmental law. And within that, I think the fact that we are becoming more and more aware that even our own environmental responses may lead to new environmental threats. So this is not news, but already, I'd say, 6 to 7 years ago, for instance, under the Convention on Biological Diversity, concerns was raised about how climate change measures, be that mitigation or adaptation, could have negative impacts on biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. In other fora, potential negative impacts on human rights were also identified. And there are other areas of environmental protection where we haven't been really very holistic in our understanding. We've taken a tunnel vision that has helped reaching one objective, but not necessarily been in a supportive manner to other international environmental objectives. In addition, I think there's also the understanding that the combination of pressures, so cumulative impacts, give us a sense of heightened level of protection that are needed and for which different elements of international environmental governance may not quite be well equipped. And in fact, this leads me, I think, to a few characteristics that I want to lay there in terms of introduction about what is it that is specific about global environmental governance, international environmental governance, and why do these characteristics make it important for us to reflect on whether the structure is equipped or not. These are somehow the benchmarks, I think, that we need to reflect upon to address that question. And one is, and all these aspects are both strengths and weaknesses of international environmental governance. They're all very well known, but they still present, I think, issues that we haven't fully addressed. And I think in a way there will always be ongoing and new questions arising from it. And we have to keep working towards making those features strengths and making sure they work out as strengths as opposed to being playing out as weaknesses. So the first is fragmentation. This is a very well-known debate in international law more generally, not only something that has to do with global environmental governance, but also governance of other common goods. And in fact, this whole debate actually arose from tensions between, say, global trade regulation and global environmental protection. But even within the environmental governance sector, we have quite a lot of fragmentation, different institutions and treaties that were developed at different points in time, have different memberships and rules, and different kind of idiosyncratic processes within them. So that, you know, if you stepped into a climate change conference as opposed to stepping into a biodiversity conference, you'll immediately see that these are very two different processes. Even if on the substance there are many important links on the issues that are addressed, but the way in which they're addressed, the culture in terms of negotiations, the ways in which different actors can participate, the outcomes of those negotiations, they're very, very different. So the strength is that we may find better solutions or be able to achieve progress in one rather than the other. But the major concern about this is that, of course, we can also work across purposes. We might not necessarily harness synergistic responses from those. Linked with that, the second characteristic is that all the regimes we have in international environmental governance are evolving ones. None of them is static. Even those earlier international environmental agreements that didn't necessarily foresee a particularly iterative process of decision making have eventually evolved into periodic international negotiating processes where the objective of the treaty has been looked with fresh eyes as things evolve, where the scope, the approaches have been very much evolving in response to growing understanding of the challenges, and sometimes even rethinking about the scope of a certain treaty. So if you think, for instance, of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, that started off as a treaty that was mainly concerned with wetlands in relation to migratory birds. The scope has evolved significantly since then. The understanding of wetlands for the water cycle and the carbon cycle is such that while there is still present an important concern related to migratory birds, that is no way as prominent as it was at the start of that international environmental process. So this is a major strength of the existing international environmental governance system. It's something that's really widespread, but of course it comes with its own growing pains. It creates tensions. It can change the understanding of different governments into what they have actually subscribed to. Often negotiations are marred with questions about whether or not a certain topic is even within the mandate of a particular treaty and whether certain negotiations are moving beyond the terms of a treaty. And those issues can become actually the bottleneck in making progress on these issues. But it also shows that in many ways international environmental governance is very adaptive and there's plenty of cases that can show how it has been able to respond to new challenges. The third key element is consensus. That again is something that you may love for many reasons, but also see as a major problem in global environmental governance that is not uniformly applied across all relevant multilateral environmental agreements, but it's certainly a dominating feature of most of them. And the idea is that for how much we have different countries coming from very different viewpoints and with their very different agendas, the working towards the identification of common ground that can reasonably respond to all these different agendas and concerns is very much what is, the backbone of how international cooperation is sharpened in terms of environmental protection. That is, of course, not a smooth process necessarily, depending on times and the different fora that may be more easily or less easily achieved. It always comes at a price. So in the process I'm most familiar with, the Convention on Biological Diversity, we almost always achieve consensus, but that comes at the price of very convoluted agreed language, lots of qualifications in the decisions, often brushing under the carpet maybe some of the issues where we can have a more advanced common understanding and leaving things to be maybe worked out in the future. So consensus is not the silver bullet, but I think the process is really important, and the engagement of different governments and other actors that contribute to that consensus building process is very significant. And the understanding of all the different concerns and contributions that different governments can make in that process is incredibly enlightening in understanding what the issue, the new issue that has emerged is about, and what it is about for different participants of the international community. Importantly, from an academic perspective, achieving consensus is a very significant portion of what international lawmaking is about. Even when consensus leads to a soft law instrument, a non-legally binding instrument, it is making international law to some degree. It is committing states. It is creating a new benchmark against which state conduct will be assessed. So it is one step in a process, an iterative process of international lawmaking. There are plenty of examples where consensus soft law instruments led to, in time, a new treaty or in some cases, customer international law, but I think even more important is really looking at how some of this agreement has really led to changes and widespread changes in state practice, and maybe changes in practice at different levels as well. So not just about government conduct, but the conduct of key actors in a particular sector. And finally, the fourth feature is how these processes are science-based. Again, we can discuss whether different multilateral environmental agreements are equally based on solid scientific evidence. There's certainly been a lot of reflection as part of that adaptation of multilateral environmental processes in how we really sharpen that science policy interface. But clearly, for all issues that have to do with the environment, we expect science to play a significant role. And we expect those fora of international environmental governance to draw on the best possible science to drive further scientific research and to be able to draw on that as a basis for decision and in the search for that consensus. Now, for all these dimensions, I think the question of fragmentation is really significant, and the fact that, again, the science, the body of science may be the same that's relevant for, say, decisions on, in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, as it may be for decisions under the climate change regime or the Law of the Sea Convention. And yet, even in terms of how we understand the science base, what kind of structures we have internationally for advancing the science and assessing its status, and how then that science really influences decision-making, each regime is a bit of a universe of its own. There have been some learning across. You may be aware that, for instance, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, that was very much drawing on the example of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There's still some differences, but there's been also learning across. But yet, if we look at the substance, how, for instance, these two bodies really contribute in their own ways and through their own processes to what can be a shared evidence base, we are quite far from that still. So fragmentation is an issue. It's not necessarily always a bad thing, and we will discuss, I think, now how we can harness its positive potential, but it is something to be kept in mind. From an academic perspective, we have almost overcome this debate. There have been a lot of work. The International Law Commission has done a seminal study on this topic, and really saying, well, it is true, it is a matter of international governance more generally, that we have all these separate processes, specialisms. Sometimes decisions are taken in isolation one from the other, and sometimes these separate regimes create tensions, even if, as a matter of pure law, governments that are party to different treaties have to find ways to implement all their international obligations in a coherent manner. But the processes are different. That said, from a legal perspective, the solution is relatively straightforward, at least in principle. The international legal order needs to be a coherent whole, and we have to find solutions through interpretation mainly, but when that fails, through new lawmaking about how to make these separate international obligations and processes mutually supportive. There are several, some of them very classic approaches as to how you do that. But that said, that is more easily said than done, and sometimes finding that coherent interpretation of international obligations and approaches across different regimes is not necessarily either easy. It's not an interpretation that would come easily to mind, so that would require quite a lot of creative legal thinking, and sometimes it may require quite a lot of other resources in terms of its implementation, be that technological ones, scientific ones, or just a matter of capacities. Maybe even from a legal perspective, there's the question that, yes, international law can help us. We have all those principles that push us to find a coherent solution, and yet often international law wouldn't provide a clear-cut answer to how to bring, say, trade and environment obligations together, or biodiversity and climate change obligations together. So there is still a margin, an important margin in which, yes, we have benchmarks from international law, be that general principles or other elements, say, of treaty interpretation that could guide the discussion. But there would still be quite an area where creative thinking needs to happen, and different governments and other non-state actors would need to come up with original solutions. So the role of international law in that conversation is really that of structuring the conversation, not necessarily pointing to an obvious solution, but at least giving a sense of how to make the conversation a reasonable one that has certain limitations and certain reference points, not a conversation that's fully in the realm of politics. And crucially, I think the key message from the work of the International Law Commission on Fragmentation is that, well, even within legal interpretation and with these limitations to what's possible from a legal perspective, you may still have maybe multiple solutions at stake. You may still have multiple interpretations that could be acceptable. And the idea is that the hope is that the international community will be able to identify the one that fosters the most, the strongest form of cooperation. So in the face of a new issue, a complicated issue, finding what would enhance international cooperation, not just make it possible at the point at which we are now, but actually creates a stronger level of cooperation. So to me, at this point, the idea of what fosters increased cooperation is the challenge for international environmental governance. We've learned a lot, but I think we also have come time and again to situations where the result was not fostering a more intense form of international cooperation. And that, I think, speaks also to questions about the evolution of the regimes, reaching consensus, and the role of science. So in my own answer to how we can better equip international environmental governance in responding to new challenges or new challenges to existing objectives, I'll try and suggest 3 ways for us to think about that. So the first is, can we think of ways in which the existing international environmental regimes can foster learning? So really looking at the fact that, yes, we understand the process of international environmental governance is iterative, because problems always evolve and new threats come up and new issues come up. So how can we foster learning as part of that conversation, which often is very polarized on new issues? And how we can foster that learning on the basis of dialogue among states, but also other non-state actors, so across the international community. The second point will be about how the dialogue based on learning, how can that produce a process which is about building a partnership. That, to me, is what an enhanced form of international cooperation is about. It's not about, a one-off problem-solving issue. We can, if we're lucky, we may be able to do it, but that wouldn't mean the end of a certain problem in a certain international environmental regime. It's really about how we foster that sense of, across differences in power and resources among governments and states, how we forge partnerships where we all have the same voice and the same influence, and we work together as partners in addressing that issue. And the third point will be about, well, in doing that, there'll always be people that will fall out. Partnerships are never perfect. So can we get a harder legal edge to what we're doing, to what we're trying to achieve under global environmental governance? And this is what lawyers maybe are obsessed about. But there is a question, there is an underlying, I think, feature in international environmental law when we compare it to other areas of international law, which is we have treaties that, on the whole, are a bit weaker on compliance and enforcement, where obligations are more broadly worded. Again, that's a strength, because what we discussed earlier on in terms of having regimes that are very evolutive and responsive to changes, that helps. But on the other hand, it means that often in international environmental negotiations and in assessment of performance vis-à-vis the obligations, it's quite hard to point the finger at a situation where we have a clear violation, say, of a treaty term. And even when we have that sense that things are not quite right, that we would expect more from governments in terms of their international obligations, we may not really have stronger legal means to respond. I mean, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what we may need all the time. We have a lot of compliance mechanisms that take a constructive and non-adversarial approach, and they have shown their value time and again. But there still are situations where you'd want to have the choice of something that maybe has a bit of more teeth legally. And I want to share with you a point which I think arises from recent international developments that may show to a path in that way that wouldn't need to have any change in international environmental governance as it is, but rather play with the synergy across different areas of international law. So starting with the first idea, the idea of how do we enhance the potential for learning in international environmental governance. This is an area where I think more than lawyers, actually international relations scholars can provide quite a lot of insights. There's quite a lot of research that has been done on regime interactions, and really looking at the fact that, yes, we may have these regimes that are separate from each other, sometimes they're partially overlapping, maybe they're in competition, there's no hierarchy among them, even if some may have much more political clout than others. And sometimes that is a tension, there's a question about wasting resources in one or the other, not really achieving shared objectives. They act very independently from the other, even if in theory they should be very interdependent. So the key insight from this area of research is that this is a problem, but it's also a richness of the system. It's actually something that can really work to your advantage if you manage regime interaction. So it's not about just seeing it as in a negative light and somehow thinking very, either kind of politically rejecting the whole issue, we can't just deal with this, or we don't want to discuss, say, intellectual property rights in the context of a biodiversity negotiation. It's seen, well, this is an opportunity for us to look at how we can co-govern a certain issue while respecting separate mandates and separate processes. And there are very deliberate strategies that can be used to make that tension, which is often very politically charged, to work towards learning and, at the very least, information sharing. Because again, the whole idea of fragmentation is that we have highly specialized regimes. And with that comes a lot of very specialized knowledge and understanding of the nitty-gritty details of one area or another. And that's a richness. We can't obviously go into all the depths of, say, intellectual property under the Convention on Biological Diversity, and yet we can learn from those processes where that is the key subject matter and think about, however, implications for biodiversity that would not be obvious or necessarily seen it to their full extent in the context of a separate regime that's more interested with, say, economic growth or the promotion of innovation. And what's interesting there is that, seen from the perspective of international relations, what we're looking at is saying, well, there can be regulatory approaches to this, and there's quite a few that have already been experimented with, and you'll hear quite a lot over the week as well. There's ways to either permit or even prescribe a certain behavior in the relationship across the regimes. That can be done in the treaty themselves. You have clauses that deal with relationships with other agreements. So the Convention on Biological Diversity has one that regulates, to some extent, its relationship with the Convention on the Law of the Sea. But usually those provisions only help so far. Sometimes they're actually so convoluted that they don't help at all. But this is really just one way to address this. The other is saying, well, can we take an enabling approach? And if so, what would that entail? And that may have to think about, well, how can we make connections among regimes which are about creating knowledge or enhancing capacities to understand what the issue, in the middle of these two regimes is about, and how we can devise together a shared approach to that. And that can be done in different ways. Again, some approaches have been quite extensively experimented with. So exchange of information across regime, that's done on a very regular basis. Often you even have standing agenda items in certain multilateral environmental agreements where you hear about developments in other processes. UNEP has done a lot of work about joint reporting on the implementation of obligation across different regimes. And there have been quite a lot of agreements among secretariats to work together and from an administrative perspective, let's say, identify where the regimes can contribute to each other's work. But this, to my mind, is a bit of a bureaucratic approach. It's helpful, but it's not necessarily an approach that maximizes the learning. Something that maybe goes a step further is thinking about joint assessments across regimes, inviting experts or independent experts that can maybe have a bit more leeway than a secretariat or a party would do in looking at what are the opportunities for learning across regimes, and even through separate machineries and approaches, identifying action that can work towards shared objectives. And some of this we see maybe more under international human rights law, as we see, for instance, under international environmental law. And so, for instance, we have many of the UN special rapporteurs. They work on issues that are actually addressed across a variety of international human rights treaties. But they don't necessarily go into the whole question, well, how, which parties are party to this agreement or that agreement. They look at the issues and what has been learned, maybe in different fora, or is coming up as a common solution across these different regimes, and really have that thinking about, well, what is helpful here, and what can we learn from these different treaties. So that, in a way, it's not that it bypasses the legal questions and the political questions about separate regimes, but it really looks at and offers to that political and legal discussions elements that would otherwise be missed by just sticking to that view. There are also opportunities for other actors to contribute to that learning. Non-state actors or even states individually can take initiatives autonomously to try and experiment with certain opportunities that can build across insights from different regimes. That may be done through unilateral means or, say, bilateral treaties. Quite a few countries are experimenting with bilateral trade and investment agreements and picking up on issues that are arising from different international environmental governance issues. There are risks with that approach. Of course, well, first of all, they may create legal uncertainty. A certain country may kind of push for a certain interpretation of relevant international obligations, and they may or may not be allow for the same level of debate that you would have in a multilateral forum. But it also allows for experimentation and for maybe trying to gather evidence about a possible approach that the international community as a whole is not ready to accept, but also doesn't have really the knowledge to see whether that may work or not. And of course, that can also be an approach that non-state actors can take. NGOs or coalition of different actors may try and pioneer or experiment with certain approaches that would arise across different regimes, and then offer what's been learned to one fora or the other. And I think this then links back to the question of legal interpretation, which is the solution that the International Law Commission offered in terms of navigating issues of fragmentation. How do we, as lawyers, suggest creative or helpful interpretations that can allow us to find more mutually supportive solutions to those issues that appear as tensions across different regimes? And interesting, this idea of mutual supportiveness is seen in scholarly debates as a corollary to sustainable development. It's really maybe one of the key roles for international legal scholars and practitioners to help really realize that idea of sustainable development, and thinking about how we ensure synergies in the efforts towards achieving different sustainable development goals. And so here, that's how I think we transition from how we imagine legal interpretation into this idea of partnership building that I mentioned earlier on. So how do we advance this kind of legal interpretation? Well, it's first of all about understanding the different sides to the debate, really understanding where different countries are coming from and their legitimate expectations, which is one of the general principles we have in international law. Why are different governments at loggerheads on certain issues, where are they on, how are they justifying their positions, and what kind of concerns do they raise, and how are these concerns protected internationally. And then on that basis, looking at what would be a proposal that would allow for responding to those legitimate concerns with a minimum disturbance to the overall legal framework that can be a proof of good faith and effectiveness. So making sure that each treaty would be interpreted in a way that really doesn't make any of its parts no longer effective or important in a situation, but really working towards a specific objective. So it's about dialogue in a way. It's about understanding what the issues are, in what ways they're already protected internationally, and how we can find the interpretation that responds and kind of mediates across all these issues, but in a way that takes into account both the specificities of those different international regimes and finds ways to look at the different objectives in a way that fosters synergy as opposed to competition. And that, to my mind, is what leads to this idea of a global partnership. The fact that this can't be an effort, it's an effort that's based on dialogue and a really deep engagement with arguments from different delegations and non-state actors. And it has to do with that idea that we want everybody to be on board. Whatever solution we find, we do need that broad-based cooperation and deeper level of commitment to address that new issue that kind of goes beyond what we had initially envisaged in one regime on the other. And so it's about giving like a full effect to a treaty while trying to go beyond maybe the letter of the treaty, understanding how the terms can be understood in an evolutive way. And usually, I mean, yes, there are technical solutions, there may be different arguments, but my argument would be that from moving from maybe a more technical and bureaucratic approach to this into partnership building, what we need to do is lift the veil of equal sovereignty among states and looking at questions of power and power imbalances in the international community. And this is not something that's incredibly radical. We have, as a general principle of international law, the idea of equity, and that very much has to do with the fact that even if governments formally, states formally are all sitting in the same level, they have different influence and opportunities to address certain issues, identify certain issues, and push for certain solutions. And so the question of fairness has to do both with the process, the degree to which we have due process for engaging in that dialogue and giving the same voice to different participants in that dialogue. And it has a substantive perspective, which is really finding a solution that would be acceptable to different states as a just, would be perceived as a reasonably just approach in terms of costs and benefits. So the principle of equity is something that makes most lawyers very shy. Not many want to engage with it. It's there, but we don't think that necessarily that can be something that then when we go into the nitty-gritty of law and international law, we can really say much about. But I think that there are areas in international law where we've done more with this, and there is a potential for international environmental governance to also engage with that and use that as one element to address the new challenges. So in the area of international investment law, for instance, international arbitrators have not shied away from looking into what fairness and equity mean in the context of investments. And I think what's really interesting, I mean, beyond not going into the debate of whether we maybe as environmental lawyers consider their approach to fairness and equity fair, but the legal reasoning is interesting for our purposes. And what they've done is actually relying on human rights principles and say, well, there are certain expectations that we have for a fair and equitable treatment. And this has to do with due process, non-discrimination, proportionality. So a mix of procedural and substantive aspects that on the face of them, I think can be quite widely shared. In international biodiversity law, we have another concept that is very much linked to that, and that's fair and equitable benefit sharing. It's not necessarily as the fairness and equity in it have not been addressed so head-on as it has happened in international investment law, but we have had quite a series of legal developments that have tried to address through this concept the question of power imbalances in particular sectors of environmental governance, mainly in the context of bio-based innovation, so access to genetic resources for research and development, but increasingly also in other areas that have to do with more traditional uses of natural resources. So that may have to do with mining and logging, it may have to do with the creation of protected areas. And what's interesting is that while I think in international biodiversity law we may not quite think we have done enough to really operationalize fair and equitable benefit sharing, and in fact I would say that in all the regimes we have that are built upon this concept, we still have quite a lot of work to do to make it operational and achieve its objectives. International human rights bodies have picked up more and more on some instruments that have been developed under international biodiversity law to show that they're still helpful to shed light on how we can interpret state obligations at the crossroads of environmental protection and human rights, particularly in as far as the rights of indigenous peoples are concerned, but not only. And not only that, but they've also indicated that the guidance that has been agreed upon in relation to fair and equitable benefit sharing can also be helpful to understand the expectations that the international community has in vis-a-vis private companies. So what I'm saying here is these are all areas of international law that are not settled. There's debates going on both politically at the multilateral level. There's lots of problems at the level of implementation on the ground, but it just shows the possibilities of that integrated interpretation that looks at the sticky point underneath the surface of the law and the politics, and that's what are the equity issues. And by acknowledging them, we're not going to solve them from one day to the next, but we may start to think about what is the role of law in addressing those equity issues together with the environmental issues we're looking at. And as I said, I mean, this is not a silver bullet. There's no fixing something. We're moving away maybe from problem solving in a way, even if that remains there, but it is more of a path of partnership building, understanding that these are the underlying issues and that we have to at least look them in the face and see how we can, as an international community, understanding all the sides of the debate, and that means very different views about what kind of equity is at stake, work with that. So I think in international environmental governance we have other concepts that deal with equity. They don't necessarily make things easier. I mean, fair and equitable benefit sharing doesn't make things easier, and that's the same for common but differentiated responsibility in other international environmental fora. But they are crucial points, and I think that's where academia may help, in that having more leeway to work on these concepts, maybe beyond the political constraints that we have in governance structure, look at, well, what is the evidence on the ground internationally about those equity issues? Often these arguments are made in abstract terms internationally, so scholars can contribute to gather evidence and offer the evidence in those discussions. But I can also look at things that have worked, things that have not worked, offer solutions that can provide, rather than a very principled high-level discussion, some more concrete, detailed discussion. And sometimes the details are the ones on which governments can agree, even across very different, more abstract positions, or they can work with how these details can be addressed. And also looking at the implications. So I think research can also provide implications about, well, we are aware that there is an equity issue here. We may or we may not decide to address it in more detail in international environmental governance. Well, this is some of the evidence of what happens if we decide not to address it, or if we address it in one way or the other. And so provide a bit more evidence or thinking around the implications of how you decide and to what degree you decide to engage with the equity issue in terms of international environmental governance. And this is not just something that has to do with how we take action on environmental issues, it's also to do with the science base. And there's quite a few equity issues within science and within research and within knowledge production, which usually in international environmental governance we don't engage with. So first of all, different sources of knowledge. We've seen some progress in integrating the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples with the kind of more Western or modern science. This is happening in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's happening in the IPBES. But of course, we're just at the start of that. And we are at a situation where more often than not, you wouldn't consider necessarily traditional knowledge on the same par as other sources of knowledge. But even within Western science, there's quite a lot of power dynamics at play. I mean, who sets research priorities? Which scientists get a chance to go and conduct research in the most, in the deepest part of the oceans or other very high risk and high cost areas, and who sets the terms for that research? That is not a level playing field, and you may all well know that of the many international obligations we have on scientific cooperation and capacity building and technology transfer, those are among those obligations that are usually, we lag behind in terms of implementation. And that eventually basically plays out in the context of science. So there's a question there about how those limitations in contributing to scientific advancements then have implications for the voice that different states may have in negotiations. And we're having more international environmental agreements where that is becoming an issue. But it remains something that, again, as other equity issues, is not necessarily addressed very directly, or it's addressed to some extent, but maybe not to the full extent. Within that, there's also a question of power imbalance among different disciplines. Of course, I think when we think about science-based, we all think about natural sciences, but quite a few agreements, and I think in academia, the understanding is that just gives us one part of the understanding, but social sciences could and should play a bigger role in our understanding of the science base. And in fact, I would say social sciences may help us more in thinking about how international environmental governance can be more effective. I mean, governance is a social process. Science is a social process. Decision-making, consensus building, implementation, they're all social processes. And yet, I wonder how many times we've seen social scientists being invited to different multilateral environmental agreements meetings to contribute to those discussions, or how many of them are, consultants to the secretariats. So I think that there's an opportunity there. And again, I mean, in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, in the context of the UN Decade on Ocean Science, we have this conversation. This has been identified as one issue, the not equal place of social sciences in the construction of the science base we need. But I think there's even another potential, which is bringing social sciences into our thinking of governance itself. And one of the points I was making earlier, the whole idea of making these processes about learning, that's, for instance, having a deep engagement with the science of education. That could be one possibility, or using arts for helping us to discuss and see things in different ways and address issues where maybe we have stated the same position over and over again, see things in a slightly different manner. We haven't yet experimented enough with those, and there's a potential there for the conversation among states and others to be different. With that, I move, I think, to the last bit, the last dimension of maybe what can make international environmental governance more equipped to address environmental issues and new environmental issues, and where we can find opportunities for a harder legal edge. Not that we need it all the time, but we may want to have it at hand if needed. And that, I think, to me, is the connection between human rights and the environment. Which both speaks to opportunities to use existing international instruments to support compliance under international environmental agreements, but we find that structure elsewhere. But it also speaks to the effort of policy coherence, of mutual supportiveness, of really being able to work towards achieving all the SDGs, not just picking one and hoping that the rest will not be too undermined by what we're trying to do. So you may be aware that in the past few years, I think, even if this is a topic that's been discussed in academia and at the UN for a very long time, it's only been in the last 3 to 4 years that we get a much clearer understanding of the factual and legal interdependence of international human rights law and international biodiversity law. There still remain a few governments who are very either concerned or have different positions on this relationship. But particularly the work of the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Professor John Knox, has really served to, I think, crystallize an understanding of how we can't really achieve international environmental objectives without engaging with international human rights law, and we can't really realize international human rights law without also protecting the environment. So our understanding of how our basic human rights to life, to health, to water and food depends and can't really be achieved without us being successful in our efforts of environmental protection is now not only clear, but we have much more science, I think, to back it up. From a legal perspective, what does that matter? Why does that matter? I think there's a few points that John Knox has identified which show that there's quite a lot of practical benefits in terms of effectiveness of international environmental law if we engage with that interrelationship with human rights. It may help to raise awareness about environmental priorities within constituencies that wouldn't usually be particularly interested in it. It can also show how we need the same level of priority for environmental protection than we have for food, access to food and water and human health, which again may or may not be an obvious standing point at the level of political priorities in different countries. It does help to raise the profile of environmental protection, and there have been cases where that connection has led to reforms of environmental law at the national level that have made standards higher. It's also helped with access to justice and with looking at creating a safety net where we have gaps in national environmental law. But I think to me, maybe the most interesting aspect of the work that John Knox has done, which has culminated in the 2018 UN Framework Principles on Human Rights and the Environment, is saying, well, he called for international recognition of a human right to a healthy environment, but not as a new human right, as something that's already existing as of international law as it stands today. The way in which the two areas of international law have evolved is such that we already have a human right to a healthy environment. It may be implicit. It has been mainly derived through interpretation. There's also quite a lot of state practice, but that right is already there. The point is not all constitutions, and internationally we don't have that stated explicitly. But the obligation is still there. I mean, again, a few countries would argue against this position, and depending on which international human rights treaty they're party to or not, they may have a stronger or weaker legal argument. So John Knox conceded that, well, even for those countries that can have a strong legal argument that that's not positive law in as far as their treaty obligations are concerned or their understanding of international customary law is concerned, this is good practice. And you would have a very hard time trying to justify your conduct as a state if you were going against that, really undermining that interlinkage between human rights and the environment. So what do we do with that other than, depending on where you stand, being in favor of that argument or being troubled by that argument? I think from a strategic perspective of international environmental governance, that means that those international obligations that usually are framed in broader terms in an environmental context become actually much sharper. What international human rights is really good at, much better than international environmental law is saying, well, this is the minimum conduct acceptable by a government. Everything below is just not doing the trick. So in the context, for instance, of international biodiversity law and international human rights law, but increasingly also international climate change law, using human rights is a way to understand what is the limit of the discretion of states in implementing their international obligations, particularly international environmental obligations. And while usually you have a lot of leeway for means of implementation and approaches, you can look at situations where a state is just not doing enough. And that has to do with the enactment of legally binding instruments at the national level, the use of sufficient monitoring efforts to make sure those laws are implemented, sufficient regulation of the private sector, and access to effective remedies. So all of that restricts the margin of discretion of states or their possibilities to justify their own action under multilateral environmental agreements with some specific standards that under international human rights law are quite specific. It also provides for new avenues, including international avenues, to bring states, to hold states accountable. So increasingly, UN special rapporteurs, not just the one on human rights and the environment, are looking into state conduct and private sector's conduct that has to do with the interface between environmental protection and human rights. And we have regional and other international human rights bodies that can play and increasingly are playing that role. Again, mainly in the area of indigenous peoples' human rights, but there's no reason why they couldn't look at that more broadly. And again, the understanding that we have now, for instance, the work that WHO has done with the Convention on Biological Diversity on bringing together the evidence base about how human health, everybody's human health, depends on healthy ecosystems, can be a new area, I think, where we may see more use of international human rights instruments and arguments to, I think, advance or raise the bar of ambition in terms of international environmental law. But that, I think, the other point may be to conclude in terms of how that governance can become even more better equipped to address these new challenges is saying, well, this is not just an area where as environmental governance experts and lawyers, we just learn from human rights and we don't give back. There's quite a lot that we have to offer to the international human rights community for us to work together in a new, I think, alliance. My understanding of the increasing practice in international human rights law is that while they are very good at those matters of understanding where state efforts are not sufficient and where access to courts is also not sufficient, they don't have the same granular understanding of environmental governance and natural resource governance, the nitty-gritty understanding of what it takes to go through a licensing process, not only an environmental impact assessment process, but strategic environmental assessments, where how the decision works around the creation and the management of protected areas. This is the bread and butter of environmental lawyers, or in terms of devising climate change response measures. That is, again, very specialistic areas, very technical areas, and that's where we need to learn more, really understand what are the specific entry points or the specific bottlenecks in environmental governance from the international to the national to the local level, where a human rights argument or approach could make a difference. So that would be really looking at much more collaboration and mutual learning, both across the institutions in international environmental governance and international human rights law, but also at the level of experts, practitioners, and activists. So I may leave it at that, maybe just to say that, of course, academia also has a lot of ways in which it can step up its support to international environmental governance, and different ways in which we make sure that the research is helpful and addresses the key bottlenecks and issues that are identified in various fora in international environmental governance. So that's a topic I never tire of discussing, but we may leave it for either the questions or maybe some other time during the week.
Thank you so much, Elisa. And now there's an opportunity to ask questions and make comments, so the floor is open. Yes, please.
Thanks. Those are great questions. So on consensus, there are few international environmental agreements where we have voting and a practice of voting. CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, is one. There are others. I have to say they're not the ones I'm most familiar with. I've actually never been in a voting MEA fora. But even in those fora, you have quite a lot of still consensus building on other issues. So the voting is really restricted to certain areas, but they don't cover the whole regime. And there's quite a lot of effort in trying to reach consensus anyway. But there are some strategic advantages to voting, and in the CITES process, for instance, there has been one way in which the regime has evolved significantly and with very creative interpretation of the existing obligations within the treaty led to a system of trade sanctions, which wasn't quite spelled out in the treaty as such. So there's definitely important lessons to be learned in terms of voting, and again, it may be something that has its own both strengths and weaknesses, but it is the exception rather than the rule, and it does bring with it that idea that we're maybe giving up some hope of that really as broad-based cooperation as we can, but in some, it has proven helpful. So the point on citizen science is really interesting. When I was speaking about social sciences, I was really thinking of area of science like anthropology, sociology, literature, language studies. So these are all kind of academic disciplines. Citizen science is more to do with engaging citizens who are not working in academia and contributing to the production of knowledge. I think it's a very exciting area where also researchers are very much both realizing the limits of their own capacity, but also engaging, realizing that co-production of knowledge shouldn't be an elitist experiment or effort. And again, I think social sciences may help to think about in what ways you can be most effective in engaging citizens in those approaches. There's also quite a lot of work done by civil society in engaging, and through that engagement you hope that it won't just be, through the contribution to science, you'll have a broader base of citizens that will also care about the objectives for which you are gathering that information, so become more and more proactive contributors to the reaching of international environmental objectives. This is an area where I think we have a lot of experimentation, not necessarily maybe enough documentation of lessons learned across, and so I think a huge area of learning for, I think, the whole of international environmental governance. And I think an area where researchers can make a contribution. The third was a comment. Yes. Yeah, so urgency, I think, is something that often when you're in negotiations you feel is not quite there, even if you would expect it to be. To some extent, I think international human rights law brings that, and the idea of having a hard legal edge is about bringing that sense of urgency if it's not quite there, but it's not the only way to do it. Again, if we think about it in terms of different disciplines, there's a whole area of research on social movements, and we're seeing, almost every day now in the news how different groups are mobilizing to bring that sense of urgency where it seems to be missing. I think it's quite difficult to know what will really be successful in bringing and maintaining that sense of urgency, and often you need many different interventions at different levels and through different doors in a way. But I think international human rights law can help in some ways. Science can help in others, but I think social sciences as well, understanding how as humans we understand urgency, we react to urgency, is something else that can contribute. I guess maybe the other side where I think social sciences are quite helpful is that, well, when we have a sense of urgency, we have also that urge to fix the problem, try and find a solution. And the reality is that often there is no one solution or one solution that will deal with some issue once and for all, and we have to accept that we have to move at different speeds at the same time. We have to try and find immediate solutions, but still keep in mind that that will be an iterative process. And the more we'll try with one approach, the more we will learn about further depth to the problem or issues, implications that we haven't quite realized at the start. The science will advance and give us more insights into these issues. So we have to accept that we can't fix the problem once and for all. It'll always be a process, but that shouldn't stop us or delay us in taking as urgent action or fully responding to the urgency out there.
Others?
Yeah, well, I hope I'm not sure I understand the last part, but recalcitrant state and states that withdraw from international cooperation. Well, I think one has to use many different strategies because, again, it's difficult to know which one or which ones will work out. And again, I mean, what seems as a weakness may also be a strength. So having a state who's been impeding advances in international cooperation, withdrawing, may actually allow everybody else to go ahead, maybe much faster or in deeper forms of cooperation. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is something that will be best addressed through, like formal governance, as opposed to different actors, state and non-state actors outside of formal governance processes. There can be all sorts of strategies that one can work out. I think legal arguments in all events can be quite important to really elaborate on all the reasons why that conduct creates an issue, both for the rest of the world as well as for that particular country. And also remembering that states are not monoliths, and there are different public offices and different public entities within a state that may continue to work towards certain objectives, even if maybe the central government is not. So there are different ways. I mean, none is a sure approach, and one has to be very creative also in finding kind of alliances across these different strategies that can be put in place. But yeah, it remains, I think, it is an indication that there are things that go, pressures or dynamics that go beyond the reach of what governance can do. And so we need to think both from the within and out with about what can be done about it.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? If not, let's then thank Elisa once more for a very inspiring opening lecture. And I think that with that, we've come to the end of the opening days program. And we're starting at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and tomorrow we'll be in a different room. So I think I'll give the floor now to Bradley, and she can brief us first of all about our dinner arrangement, the welcoming dinner tonight, and then also a little bit more details on where we should meet tomorrow morning.
I'm voice, or is it better with the microphone? Is this better? Okay. So we have dinner tonight at 7:30. Please feel free to come as you are. You don't have to get dressed up super fancy, but you're of course welcome to. It's only about 200 meters away from Il Campo. So that's the big famous square here. If you're staying at Refugio, it's very close by. So on your schedules you have the address, but it's very, very close. Secondly, tomorrow we start at 10, but it's not in here. So tomorrow when you walk into the entrance where you did today, you need to take the second set of elevators because we're on the 4th floor. So it's not the first elevators that are the closest, but the next one. The elevators closest only go up to the 3rd floor. So we're on the 4th floor, and you should be able to exit the elevator or stairs and go to your left. So I'll put signs up in the morning, and I will be going upstairs and downstairs trying to make sure everyone finds their way. So see you at 7:30.